My son brought me to this local bar for drinks, but when he stepped away, the owner grabbed my arm with shaking hands. His voice was barely a whisper as he told me something about my son that made my hands start trembling uncontrollably. I slipped out through the back while my son was distracted, my heart pounding as I began following him through the dark streets. What happened in those next few minutes turned my world upside down. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. When Derek called that afternoon suggesting drinks at Murphy's Tavern, I'd been surprised, but pleased. "Dad, let's spend some quality time together," he'd said warmly. "How about 7 o'clock? Just the two of us." It had been months since my son had initiated a get-together, so I'd eagerly agreed, even putting on my best shirt. Now I sat watching Derek return from the restroom, his designer shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. The amber liquid in my glass caught the dim tavern light as I savored this rare moment with my successful son. Rick Martinez, the tavern owner, had poured the whiskey with a heavy hand, and I appreciated his generosity. At 68, I'd learned to appreciate these times with Derek, even if they came less frequently than I'd hoped. Murphy's felt familiar in that working-class way. Cracked leather stools, old beer and fresh pretzels, neon signs buzzing overhead. I wondered why Derek had chosen this place over the upscale establishments he usually preferred. "Dad, you okay? You look a little pale." Derek slid back onto his stool, adjusting his expensive watch with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. The gesture struck me as odd. He'd been checking it all evening, almost like he was timing something important. His concern felt rehearsed, delivered with the practiced bedside manner of a doctor speaking to a patient rather than a son genuinely worried about his father's well-being. I forced a smile, swirling the whiskey Rick had poured with a heavy hand. The ice clinked against the glass like tiny bells mourning something I couldn't name. "Just tired, son. Long day at the house, trying to fix that leaky faucet again." The truth was more complicated. I'd been feeling strange all week, not sick exactly, but unsettled in a way that reminded me of those moments right before a thunderstorm when the air itself seems to hold its breath. Now, as he excused himself to take a phone call outside, I watched through the window as his entire demeanor transformed. The relaxed sun vanished, replaced by someone whose body language was all sharp angles and aggressive gestures. He paced back and forth on the sidewalk, his voice animated in a way that seemed almost violent. His free hand chopped through the air as he spoke, and even through the glass, I could see the muscles in his jaw working furiously. That's when Rick appeared at my elbow, his weathered face carved with worry lines deeper than the Grand Canyon. The owner of Murphy's Tavern had been running this place for 30 years, had seen every kind of trouble that walked through those doors. Domestic disputes, business deals that went south over, friendships that died in pools. But the way his calloused hands shook as he gripped my forearm made my stomach drop to my shoes. "Frank," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the jukebox playing some mournful country song about lost love and broken promises. "I need to tell you something about your boy. Something that's been eating at me for weeks, keeping me up at night." His eyes darted toward the window where Derek continued his animated phone conversation, then back to my face with an urgency that made my chest tight. Rick's grip on my arm tightened, his fingers digging into my flesh through my jacket. "He's been coming here with some real bad people, Frank. Not the kind of folks a respectable doctor should be associating with. They sit in that back corner booth, talking in whispers about things that would turn your hair white." He paused, swallowing hard like he was fighting back nausea. "Planning things. Talking about insurance money and making problems disappear, and your name keeps coming up in those conversations." The glass slipped from my nerveless fingers, amber liquid spreading across the bar top like spilled blood. Rick's words hit me like a physical blow, each syllable landing with the force of a sledgehammer against my chest. The familiar warmth of the whiskey turned to ice in my veins, and for a moment the entire bar seemed to tilt sideways. Last week I was cleaning tables near their booth when I heard them talking about accidents that happen to old folks. Rick continued, his voice dropping even lower. How easy it is to make something look natural when you know what you're doing. And Frank... He paused, his face gray with distress. I heard your boy telling that snake character about your habits, what time you usually go to bed, whether you lock your doors, about those health problems you mentioned to him, like he was giving instructions. Before I could process this information fully, I saw Derek ending his call and heading back toward the entrance. His face was flushed, his expensive suit slightly disheveled from his aggressive pacing. But as he approached the door, his expression smoothed into a mask of casual concern that chilled me to the bone. Without thinking, I slipped off my stool and made my way toward the back exit, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The alley behind Murphy smelled of garbage and regret, but it provided the cover I needed to watch Derek emerge from the front entrance. Instead of looking around for me or showing any concern about my absence, he turned left and walked with a confident stride. Derek moved with purpose through the winding streets of our neighborhood, checking his phone repeatedly and glancing over his shoulder with practiced paranoia. I followed at a distance, my 68-year-old knees protesting every step as I struggled to keep pace without being detected. After 20 minutes of this strange dance through increasingly deserted streets, Derek ducked into an alley behind the old Paramount Theater. I pressed myself against the brick wall at the alley's entrance, my breath coming in short gasps that formed small clouds in the cold air. The voices from deeper in the alley carried clearly in the still night, each word falling like stones into the pit of my stomach. Is the old man getting suspicious? The voice belonged to someone I'd never heard before, gravelly and rough, like he'd been smoking cigarettes since childhood and washing them down with broken glass. Because if he is, we need to move this timeline up. I don't like loose ends, and I especially don't like loose ends that might talk to cops. Derek's laugh was sharp and bitter, nothing like the warm chuckle I remembered from his childhood when I'd taught him to ride his first bicycle or helped him with algebra homework at this very kitchen table. Frank doesn't suspect anything, Snake. The man trusts me completely. It's almost pathetic how naive he is after all these years, still sees me as his little boy who could do no wrong, despite all evidence to the contrary. I crouched behind a rusted dumpster that reeked of rotting vegetables and broken dreams, biting down on my knuckle to keep from making a sound. The taste of my own blood mingled with the bile rising in my throat as I listened to the casual cruelty in Derek's voice. This was like listening to a stranger wearing my son's face, speaking words that the Derek I'd raised could never have formed with his lips. You know what's really beautiful about this whole situation? Derek continued, and I could hear him moving around, probably pacing the way he always did when he was excited about something. The old man actually thanked me last week for being such a caring son. He was going on and about how grateful he was that I was taking such good care of his health, making sure he took his medication regularly. Snake's gravelly laugh echoed off the alley walls. That's cold, even for someone in my line of work. Most people at least feel a little guilt when they're planning to leave a family member. Guilt is a luxury I can't afford, Derek replied with the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. Frank Thompson served his purpose in creating the successful Dr. Derek Thompson. Now it's time for him to make his final contribution to that success. His death will fund the next phase of my life. A phase where I'm finally free from the embarrassment of having a blue-collar father dragging down my social status. The words hit me like physical blows. I thought about the pride I'd felt watching Derek accept his medical degree, how I'd worked extra shifts for months just to afford a decent suit for his graduation ceremony. I'd wanted to look respectable standing next to my son on his big day, never imagining that my working-class background was something he was ashamed of. "How long have you been planning this?" Snake asked with what sounded like professional curiosity. "Honestly?" "The idea first occurred to me about 2 years ago when I started moving in higher social circles," Derek replied. I was at a medical conference in Chicago, networking with some of the most prominent doctors in the country, when one of them asked about my family background. When I mentioned that my father was a retired factory worker, the conversation just died. You could see the judgment in their eyes, the way they suddenly saw me as less than them. Derek's voice grew harder, more bitter. That's when I realized that Frank Thompson wasn't just my father. He was a liability. Every time someone asked about my background, every time I had to explain how I'd grown up, it undermined my credibility in their eyes. They couldn't see past the blue-collar origins to appreciate the sophisticated professional I'd become. "So you decided to eliminate the problem," Snake said. "I decided to take control of my narrative," Derek corrected. "Think about it. A successful doctor whose father died tragically from heart complications becomes much more sympathetic than a successful doctor whose father still lives in a rental house and fixes his own plumbing. Tragedy elevates people, makes them seem more deserving of success. I felt sick listening to Derek reduce my entire existence to a public relations problem that needed to be solved. The man I'd raised was discussing my death like it was a career move, a strategic decision designed to enhance his professional image. "Good," the man called Snake replied, and I heard the distinctive sound of someone spitting into the gravel. "Because that life insurance policy you took out on him is worth serious money. $500,000 is nothing to sneeze at, especially when you factor in the property he'll leave behind and whatever cash he's got stashed away. And the beauty of it," Derek continued, "is that it will look completely natural. I've been slipping him small doses of digitalis for weeks now, nothing lethal, just enough to make him feel weak and disoriented, to create a medical history of heart problems. When the accident happens, the autopsy will show an elderly man with a weak heart who died from trauma sustained in a fall." My hand flew to my chest. The weakness I'd been feeling, the dizzy spells, the fatigue. It wasn't a natural decline. My own son had been slowly poisoning me, systematically weakening my body to make my murder look like natural death. Through a gap in the dumpster, I watched Derek hand Snake an envelope thick with cash. "Half now, half when it's done. And I want it to look good, convincing enough that no one raises questions about the circumstances." Snake pocketed the money with casual efficiency. "Don't worry, Doc. I've been in this business for 20 years. Poor old Frank Thompson is going to have a very unfortunate accident next week. Maybe a fall down those steep stairs to his basement. Old houses like his, they're just accidents waiting to happen." The basement stairs. I thought about those narrow wooden steps, how many times I'd warned myself to install a better railing. Now I realized Derek had been studying those stairs during his recent visits, calculating angles and impact points. "The timing is crucial," Derek said, pulling out his phone. "I need to be at the hospital during a surgery that will last at least 4 hours. Can you handle it Tuesday evening around 8 o'clock? "Tuesday works perfectly," Snake replied. "But what about afterward? You want me to call it in, or let someone else find the body?" Derek considered this. "I'll discover him Wednesday morning when I come by for our weekly coffee." "Perfect timing. The body will be fresh enough for a clear cause of death determination, but not so fresh that it looks suspicious." They shook hands like business partners, not a son and his hired killer planning the murder of a father who'd sacrificed everything for love. As they began to part ways, Derek called out casually, "Oh, and Snake? Make sure you search the house afterward. The old man keeps cash hidden everywhere, inside coffee cans, taped under drawers, sewn into coat linings. Consider it a bonus for good work." I remained frozen behind that dumpster long after their footsteps faded into the night. The son I'd raised, the boy I'd read bedtime stories to, the man I'd been so proud to see succeed. He wasn't just planning to murder me for money. He was doing it with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. The walk home felt like moving through molasses, each step heavier than the last. My house felt like a crime scene I hadn't died in yet. The basement stairs Derek and Snake had discussed loomed in the darkness like a death trap waiting to spring. I sat in my kitchen until dawn, staring at the bottle of heart medication Derek had insisted I start taking last month. The label read, "For irregular heartbeat and chest pains," in Derek's precise handwriting. But now I knew it contained digitalis, slowly poisoning me in preparation for the slaughter. As the morning sun filtered through my kitchen window, I found myself staring at an old photo magneted to the refrigerator. Derek at his medical school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride. The young man in that picture seemed like a stranger now, but the memories came flooding back anyway. After Sarah died in that car accident 15 years ago, Derek was all I had left. He was 20 then, halfway through college, devastated by losing his mother. I remember holding him as he sobbed at the funeral, promising him that everything would be okay, that we'd get through it together. I'd already been working double shifts at Patterson Manufacturing, but after Sarah's death, I picked up weekend truck driving to ensure Derek's education wouldn't suffer. The house we'd lived in since Derek was born had been our sanctuary. 3 bedrooms painted in Sarah's favorite colors, a big backyard where Derek had played baseball, flower beds blooming with her roses. When Derek got accepted to medical school, the tuition was crushing. We sat at my kitchen table going over the numbers, trying to find a way to make it work. "Dad, you don't have to do this," he'd said when I mentioned selling the house. "I can take out loans, work part-time during school." "Son," I'd replied, putting my hands on his shoulders, "you're going to be a doctor. You're going to help people, save lives. Your mother would be so proud. This house is just wood and brick. Your future is worth so much more." The work nearly killed me. 40 hours a week at the factory damaged my joints. Weekend truck driving wrecked my back. Evening maintenance work meant mopping floors while Derek studied safely in his dorm room. But every semester's tuition payment felt like a victory. When he graduated, I was in the front row, clapping until my palms were raw. Derek seemed genuinely grateful then, often saying, "Dad, I'm going to take care of you now. You've given me everything." For a while it seemed like he meant it. He'd call regularly, take me to dinner, and ask about my health. But gradually, the warm son who used to call just to chat became the distant professional who only contacted me when he needed something. The change had been so gradual that I'd attributed it to natural evolution. He was busy building his practice, establishing himself. I told myself this was what success looked like, that some distance was normal. I remembered last Christmas when he'd given me that expensive bottle of cognac. "You deserve the best, Dad," he'd said. Now I wondered if he had already been planning my death, calculating how much my life was worth in insurance money. The most painful realization wasn't that Derek wanted me dead. It was that he saw me as nothing more than a financial burden who'd outlived his usefulness. The man I'd sacrificed everything to raise viewed his father as an obstacle to be removed. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through our recent text messages. They were brief, business-like exchanges. No, "I love you, Dad." Just efficient communication from someone managing an inconvenient responsibility. The medication bottle sat on my counter like an accusation. How many times had Derek handed it to me personally, watching to make sure I took it, monitoring my gradual decline with clinical interest? His medical knowledge had been a weapon pointed at my heart, literally. I spent the next 3 days playing the role of the unsuspecting father while secretly documenting everything that might save my life. The medication bottle went straight to my old friend Jim Patterson, a retired police detective who owed me a favor from when I'd helped him rebuild his truck engine years ago. Jim lived alone in a modest ranch house about 20 minutes from my place, his walls covered with commendations and photographs from 30 years on the force. "Frank, are you sure about this?" Jim asked as I handed him the pills, his craggy face etched with the kind of concern that comes from seeing too much human cruelty over the years. His living room smelled of coffee and old leather, the comfortable chaos of a man who'd spent his retirement puttering with engines and woodworking projects. "Because if what you're telling me is true, we're talking about attempted murder here. That's serious business, not something you want to get wrong." "I know what I heard, Jim. My son is planning to kill me, and these pills are part of the setup." The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth, like dialogue from a bad movie rather than the horrible reality of my life. I need to know what's really in them before I confront him. Jim studied the prescription bottle with the methodical attention he'd once given to crime scenes. "Dr. Derek Thompson," he read aloud. "Your boy's got good handwriting for a doctor. Most of them scribble like they're writing prescriptions during an earthquake." He shook the bottle, listening to the pills rattle around inside. "How long have you been taking these?" "About 6 weeks. Derek said my heart rhythm was irregular, that I needed something to stabilize it." I remembered how caring he'd seemed when he'd handed me that first bottle, how he'd insisted on watching me take the first pill to make sure I understood the dosage. Jim's expression darkened. "And you've been feeling weak since then? Dizzy spells? Fatigue? Getting worse every week?" I thought it was just my age catching up with me. "Frank, in my experience, when someone starts feeling worse after starting new medication, that's usually not a coincidence." Jim pocketed the bottle with the careful precision of someone who'd handled evidence for decades. "I've got a contact at a private lab, a guy who owes me a favor from when I helped clear his kid of a drug charge. He can run tests without asking uncomfortable questions or alerting anyone to what we're doing." The waiting was the hardest part. For 48 hours, I went through the motions of normal life while feeling like I was walking around with a time bomb strapped to my chest. Derek called twice during that period, both times to check on my condition and remind me to take my medication. His voice carried that same professional concern I'd once found comforting, but now it made my skin crawl. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" he'd asked during the second call, and I could hear the subtle probing in his tone, the clinical assessment hidden beneath filial concern. "A little tired, but not too bad," I'd replied, forcing normalcy into my voice while my hands shook with rage and fear. "Make sure you're taking the full dose. It's very important for your condition that you don't skip any pills." When Jim finally called with the lab results, his voice was grim as winter. "Frank, you need to sit down for this. Are you somewhere private where we can talk?" I was in my kitchen, staring out the window at the bird feeder Derek had given me last Christmas. Even that innocent gift now seemed sinister. Had he been planning this long ago? "I'm alone, Jim." "What did you find?" "The pills contain digitalis, just like you suspected." "But Frank, the dosage is what's really scary here. According to my lab contact, these aren't therapeutic doses. They're carefully calculated to create cumulative toxicity over time. Whoever prescribed these knows exactly what they're doing." I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "What does that mean in plain English?" "It means your boy's been systematically poisoning you for weeks, maybe months. The dosage is precisely calculated, enough to make you weak and create symptoms that would support a narrative of heart disease. This is medical knowledge being used as a weapon, Frank. Your son isn't just planning to kill you, he's been preparing your body for murder." The insurance investigation was even more disturbing. Jim made some calls to contacts in the industry, people who specialized in detecting fraud and had seen every scam imaginable over their careers. What we discovered made my blood run cold and my faith in my son crumble into dust. "Frank, this is worse than we thought," Jim said when he arrived at my house the next evening with a manila folder thick with documents. We sat at my kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light, and he spread out papers like a detective laying out evidence at a crime scene. "Derek didn't just take out a policy on you. He's been systematically preparing for this for months. The life insurance policy was a masterpiece of deception. Derek had taken out a $500,000 policy on my life 6 months ago, using his medical credentials to fast-track the approval process and his forged power of attorney to handle all the paperwork. The application listed him as my primary caregiver and medical decision-maker, painting a picture of a devoted son managing his elderly father's affairs. "Look at this," Jim said, pointing to a section of the application. "He listed you as having a history of heart problems, claiming you'd been experiencing irregular rhythms and chest pains for over a year. According to this, you'd been seeing him for cardiac issues since last spring." I stared at the documents in disbelief. But I never had heart problems before he started giving me those pills. My last physical showed I was in excellent health for my age. That's the beauty of his plan, Jim explained, his voice heavy with disgust. He created the medical history to support the insurance claim. Any investigator looking into your death would see a clear pattern. Elderly man with documented heart problems who died from complications related to his condition. But the most sickening discovery was yet to come. Jim's contact at the bank had provided a detailed analysis of my accounts, and what we found was financial abuse on a scale that took my breath away. Derek hadn't just been making occasional withdrawals, he'd been systematically looting my life savings with surgical precision. The really sick part, Jim explained as he showed me bank statements going back 8 months, is the pattern of the withdrawals. He's been taking just enough to avoid triggering any automatic fraud alerts, but consistently enough to drain your accounts over time. Look at this, 300 here, 500 there, sometimes 1,000 when he thought he could get away with it. The numbers were devastating. From the $15,000 I'd saved over years of careful budgeting and penny pinching, only $2,000 remained. Derek had stolen over $12,000 from his own father while planning to murder him for insurance money. Each withdrawal had been carefully timed to coincide with my doctor visits, making it look like I was paying for medical expenses. And here's the most twisted part, Jim continued, pointing to another set of documents. He's been using your stolen money to pay the premiums on the life insurance policy. Essentially, you've been funding your own murder. I felt physically sick. The son I'd raised, the man I'd sacrificed everything for, hadn't just betrayed me. He'd been using my own money to finance his plan to kill me. Every dollar he'd stolen had been another step toward my grave. There's more, Frank. My contact found something else that's going to make your blood boil. Jim pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a financial planning company. Derek's been meeting with investment advisors about what he calls his expected inheritance. He's already made plans for how he's going to invest the insurance money and whatever property you leave behind. The meeting notes were clinical in their coldness. Derek had told the financial advisor that his elderly father was in declining health and that he expected to receive a substantial inheritance within the next few months. He'd even requested projections for investment returns on $500,000, discussing portfolio diversification strategies and long-term growth potential. He's not just planning to kill you, Frank. He's planning his life after you're dead. This isn't a crime of passion or desperation. This is calculated murder for financial gain, planned and executed with the precision of a business transaction. I knew I needed more evidence before confronting Derek, and Jim insisted we set up proper surveillance to document everything. If we're going to nail this bastard, he said with the grim determination of a man who'd spent his career putting criminals behind bars, we need to be absolutely certain we have an airtight case. One mistake, and a good lawyer might get him off on a technicality. We decided I should call Derek and suggest lunch at Romano's, the Italian place where we'd celebrated his graduation from medical school 8 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. The restaurant where I'd once toasted his success would now be the scene of his downfall. Derek agreed to the lunch with that same rehearsed enthusiasm that now made my skin crawl, his voice warm with fake affection that I could finally see through. Of course, Dad. I'd love to spend more time with you. You know how much these moments mean to me. Jim spent the morning before our lunch meeting wiring me with a recording device so small it was barely visible even when I knew where to look for it. State-of-the-art equipment, he assured me as he adjusted the tiny microphone clipped inside my jacket. This thing will pick up a whisper from across the room, and the recording quality is good enough to hold up in court. What if Derek gets suspicious? I asked, trying to ignore the weight of the device against my chest. He won't. He's too arrogant, too convinced of his own superiority to imagine his old man might be smart enough to outmaneuver him. Jim's expression was hard as granite. Trust me, Frank. I've dealt with killers like your son before. They always think they're the smartest person in the room, and that arrogance is what brings them down. Romano's felt different that day. The red checkered tablecloths and garlic-scented air that had once seemed warm and welcoming now felt like props in a stage play about betrayal and murder. I arrived 15 minutes early, wanting to scope out the restaurant and make sure the recording equipment was working properly. The place was moderately busy with the lunch crowd, families and business people enjoying casual meals and conversations that didn't involve planning. I watched them laughing and talking, and for a moment I envied their normal problems: work stress, relationship issues, financial concerns that didn't involve being slowly poisoned by their own children. Derek arrived exactly on time, which should have been my first clue that something was different. Throughout his childhood and even into adulthood, Derek had always been chronically late for family gatherings, claiming that his busy schedule made it impossible to arrive punctually. But today he was precise, checking his watch as he entered the restaurant and scanning the room with the calculating gaze of someone who left nothing to chance. He looked polished and professional in his navy suit, every inch the successful doctor who commanded respect in operating rooms and hospital corridors. His expensive watch caught the light as he adjusted it, that same nervous gesture I'd noticed at Murphy's Tavern. But now I understand it wasn't nervousness at all. It was the behavior of a man operating on a carefully planned timeline. "Sorry, I'm exactly on time instead of fashionably late," Derek said, as he slid into the booth across from me, his smile perfect and completely empty. "I've been trying to be more punctual lately." Time is such a precious commodity, don't you think? There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl, a subtle emphasis on the word time that felt like a threat. Did he know that I knew? Was this entire meeting a trap designed to test whether I suspected his plans? "No problem, son. I appreciate you making time for your old man." I kept my voice steady, fighting the urge to grab him by the collar and demand answers about the poison, the insurance policy, the stolen money. The recording device felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds against my chest. Derek ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted, a casual display of control that I'd never noticed before, but now seemed sinister. "The chicken parmesan is excellent here," he said to the waitress, "and my father will have the same. He's been having some dietary restrictions lately due to his heart condition." Heart condition. The words hung in the air like an accusation. I'd never mentioned having heart problems because I'd never had them until Derek started poisoning me. But here he was, casually establishing a medical narrative for anyone within earshot, building the foundation for my eventual natural death. I wanted to talk about some concerning symptoms I've been having: weakness, dizziness, chest pains. I'm worried something might be seriously wrong with my heart. His eyes sharpened with what I now recognized as calculation rather than concern. "Dad, at your age, these things are unfortunately common. The cardiovascular system starts to show wear and tear. But that's why I'm taking the medication you prescribed," I said, pulling the bottle from my pocket. "This digitalis is supposed to help with irregular heartbeat, right?" Derek's hand tightened on mine, his grip becoming painful. "Dad, you shouldn't be researching medical treatments online. It'll just make you paranoid. Trust me, I'm a doctor, and I'm your son. Like you knew what was best when you took out that life insurance policy without telling me?" The color drained from Derek's face so quickly I thought he might faint. His hand jerked back from mine, and he spent several seconds opening and closing his mouth like a fish gasping for air. Dad, I can explain that. I was just trying to protect you, make sure you were covered in case something happened." $500,000 seems like a lot of protection for an old man with a modest pension, especially when you're already withdrawing money from my savings account without permission. Derek's expression hardened, and for the first time I saw something that chilled me, not guilt or shame, but annoyance at being caught. "You're being paranoid, Dad. Maybe the medication is affecting your thinking more than I realized. Or maybe my son is slowly poisoning me while planning to have me killed for insurance money." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Derek stared at me for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was completely different, cold, clinical, devoid of any pretense of love. You know what your problem is, Dad? You never knew when to quit. Derek's mask had finally fallen away completely. The loving son was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing his face, cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. The transformation was so complete, it was like watching someone shed their skin to reveal the serpent underneath. "You want to know the truth, old man?" He leaned back in the booth, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Yes, I've been giving you digitalis. Yes, I took out that insurance policy. And yes, I've been planning your little accident for months now." My heart hammered against my chest, but I forced myself to remain still. The small recording device Jim had given me was hidden in my jacket pocket, its tiny microphone capturing every word of Derek's confession. "You see, Dad, you've become a liability in my life. You're old, you're expensive to maintain, and frankly, you're an embarrassment to everything I've built." Derek's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone discussing a business decision. "Do you have any idea how mortifying it is to have colleagues ask about my father, the factory worker? How does it look when I have to explain that I live in a mansion while you're stuck in some pathetic rental?" Each word was like a physical blow, but I kept my expression neutral, letting him talk himself deeper into the hole. "Derek, I sacrificed everything for you. I gave up my home, my savings, my health, all so you could have the education and opportunities I never had. And I'm supposed to be grateful forever?" He laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Dad, you made your choices. You wanted to play the martyr, the noble father who gave up everything for his son's education. Well, congratulations, your sacrifice is finally going to pay off in ways you never imagined. How can you talk about killing your own father like it's a business transaction?" Derek shrugged, adjusting his expensive watch with casual precision. "Because that's exactly what it is. $500,000 in insurance money, plus whatever assets you have left, minus the modest cost of hiring Snake. It's actually quite a respectable return on investment. You've really thought this through, haven't you? Dad, I'm a doctor. I don't leave anything to chance. I've been preparing for this for months. The digitalis to weaken your heart and create a medical history. The insurance policy to ensure maximum financial benefit, even the timing to coincide with a surgery that'll give me an airtight alibi." Derek pulled out his phone and consulted what looked like a detailed schedule. "Speaking of timing, I should mention that our conversation here is basically irrelevant. Snake should be at your house right about now, making some final preparations for your unfortunate accident tomorrow evening." My chair scraped against the floor as I started to rise, but Derek's voice stopped me cold. "I wouldn't worry about rushing home, Dad. There's nothing you can do to stop what's already in motion." "You bastard!" I began, but Derek cut me off with a raised hand. "Sit down, Dad. You're not going anywhere, and you're certainly not in any condition to interfere with my plans." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That last dose I gave you this morning was significantly stronger than usual. You should start feeling the effects any minute now." As if summoned by his words, a wave of dizziness crashed over me like a physical force. My vision blurred at the edges, and I had to grip the table edge to keep from sliding off my seat. Derek watched my distress with clinical interest, like he was observing a lab experiment. "The beauty of digitalis poisoning," he said conversationally, "is that it's nearly impossible to detect without specific testing. Your autopsy will show an elderly man with a weak heart who died from trauma sustained in a fall. Very sad, completely believable, and absolutely unpreventable." But Derek had made one crucial mistake in his arrogance. He'd underestimated his old man's capacity for preparation. Fighting through the drug-induced fog, I managed to pull out my phone with trembling fingers and hit the speed dial number Jim had programmed. "What are you doing?" Derek lunged across the table, trying to grab the phone. "Insurance policy of my own," I gasped as the call connected. "Jim, it's Frank. Code red. He confessed everything. Romano's restaurant, booth 7 in the back. Send backup now." Derek's face contorted with rage as he realized his perfect plan was crumbling. "You stupid old fool! Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you know how long I've been planning this?" "I've stopped a murderer," I replied, my voice growing stronger despite the poison. "My own son, my murderer." The restaurant erupted in controlled chaos as Derek tried to flee, but the digitalis had affected his judgment. In his panic, he knocked over a waitress carrying a tray of glasses, the crash bringing every eye in the place to our table just as Jim Patterson burst through the front door with 2 uniformed officers and a paramedic team. Derek was on the ground within seconds, handcuffed and screaming about how I'd ruined everything, how I'd never understood what he needed to succeed. But his words bounced off me like rain on stone. The son I'd loved was already gone. "The recording device got everything," Jim assured me as I was loaded onto a stretcher. His confession, the details about Snake, the insurance fraud, the systematic poisoning, all of it captured in his own words. As the antidote began flowing into my system, I watched Derek being loaded into a police car. Through the window, he looked at me one last time, and what I saw wasn't love or regret. It was the cold calculation of a man already planning his next move. But as I lay on that stretcher, feeling the poison slowly leaving my system, I realized the hardest part wasn't surviving Derek's attempt to kill me. It was accepting that the son I'd raised and loved had never really existed at all. 3 months later, I sat in the courthouse gallery as Derek was sentenced to 25 years to life for attempted murder, insurance fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. The courtroom was packed with reporters, medical professionals who'd worked with Derek, and members of the community who'd followed the case through the local news. He wore an orange jumpsuit instead of his expensive suits, and the confident doctor who'd once commanded respect in operating rooms was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed convict who kept glancing back at me with something that might have been desperation or might have been rage. The trial had been a media sensation that stretched on for 6 weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and experts. "Doctor tries to murder father for insurance money" was the kind of headline that sold newspapers and generated millions of clicks online. The story had everything the media loved. A respected professional with a dark secret, an elderly victim who'd sacrificed everything for his ungrateful child, and enough plot twists to keep audiences glued to their screens. Derek's colleagues from the hospital testified about his skill as a physician and his seemingly caring bedside manner, which only made his crimes seem more monstrous. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of cardiology, broke down in tears as she described how Derek had consulted with her about digitalis dosages, claiming he was treating an elderly patient with heart problems. "He asked very specific questions about cumulative toxicity," she testified, her voice shaking with emotion. "He wanted to know how much digitalis it would take to create chronic weakness without causing immediate cardiac arrest. I thought he was being thorough in treating a patient. I never imagined he was planning to poison his own father." The prosecution, led by Detective Maria Santos, methodically built their case like constructing a building. Foundation first, then walls, then roof. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who'd prosecuted dozens of murder cases and had a reputation for never losing when the evidence was solid. And in Derek's case, the evidence was overwhelming. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Santos said during her opening statement, "this isn't just a case about attempted murder. This is a case about the ultimate betrayal. A son who used his medical knowledge, his position of trust, and his father's unconditional love as weapons in a calculated plan to commit the perfect murder." Santos presented the digitalis evidence first, bringing in toxicology experts who explained exactly how Derek had been poisoning me. Dr. Robert Chang, a forensic toxicologist from the State Crime Lab, testified that the dosages found in my pills would have eventually caused fatal cardiac arrhythmia, but only after weeks or months of gradual weakening. The perpetrator demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of cardiac pharmacology, Dr. Chang explained to the jury. This wasn't someone randomly poisoning pills. This was a medical professional who calculated exactly how much digitalis to administer to create the appearance of natural heart disease while slowly killing the victim. The insurance fraud evidence was equally damning. Santos brought in investigators who'd traced every forged document, every fraudulent application, every illegal withdrawal from my accounts. The jury saw bank records showing how Derek had systematically stolen my life savings while using that money to pay premiums on a life insurance policy that would have made him rich upon my death. The defendant didn't just plan to kill his father, Santos told the jury. He planned to profit from that murder in the most calculated way possible. He stole his father's money to fund the very policy that would have paid him $500,000 for successfully committing patricide. But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from Snake Ramirez himself. Derek's hired killer had been arrested trying to flee the state and had quickly agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Snake's testimony about their meetings, their plans, and Derek's cold-blooded instructions for making my murder look accidental left the jury visibly shaken. The doc was real specific about how he wanted it done, Snake testified, his gravelly voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Fall down the basement stairs, make it look like an accident. He even drew me a diagram of the house, showing me exactly where the stairs were and how steep they was. Said his old man went down there every morning to check the water heater so it would look natural. Derek's defense attorney, an expensive lawyer named Marcus Webb who specialized in representing wealthy criminals, tried every strategy in the book. He argued temporary insanity, claiming Derek had suffered a psychological breakdown due to the stress of his medical practice. He suggested financial desperation, painting Derek as a victim of overwhelming debt who'd made a terrible decision in a moment of panic. Webb even tried to paint me as an unreliable witness, suggesting that the digitalis poisoning had affected my mental state and made me paranoid and delusional. Frank Thompson is an elderly man who's been systematically poisoned for months, Webb argued. How can we trust his perception of events when his brain has been compromised by toxic levels of cardiac medication? But none of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, the case too airtight, Derek's own recorded confession too damning to overcome. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. When the judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood on legs that still trembled occasionally from the lingering effects of months of poisoning. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I didn't just lose my money or my health to this man's crimes. I lost my son. The real Derek died somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who saw his father as nothing more than a financial opportunity." I paused, gathering strength. I spent 35 years raising Derek, sacrificing for him, loving him unconditionally. I thought I was teaching him the value of hard work, the importance of family, the meaning of gratitude. Instead, I apparently taught him that love is something to be exploited. Derek's shoulders were shaking, but I no longer cared whether it was remorse or self-pity. I worked 3 jobs to put him through medical school. I sold our family home to fund his education. I damaged my health and sacrificed my future so he could have opportunities I'd never dreamed of. And his response was to try to murder me for insurance money. I looked directly at Derek for the first time since his arrest. I hope someday you remember the man who read you bedtime stories and taught you to ride a bike and worked himself into the ground to pay for your education, because that man loved you more than his own life, which, ironically, you tried to take. The judge's gavel fell like thunder, and Derek was led away in chains. He looked back once, his mouth moving soundlessly, but I turned away. Whatever he was trying to say was 25 years too late. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but the calm that comes from knowing justice has been served. The poison was out of my system, my stolen money had been recovered, and the man who'd tried to kill me was behind bars where he belonged. Rick Martinez met me on the courthouse steps, his weathered face creased with relief. The tavern owner had closed Murphy's early just to attend the sentencing, a gesture that meant more to me than he probably realized. "How are you holding up, Frank?" "Better than I expected," I replied honestly. It hurts, knowing what he became. But it would have hurt worse to let him get away with it. That evening, I returned to my small rental house. The basement stairs Derek had planned to use for my accident were just stairs again, recently reinforced with a proper railing. The kitchen where he'd given me poison had been deep cleaned. The house that had felt like a crime scene was simply where I lived again. I pulled out a photo album filled with pictures spanning Derek's entire life. There he was at 5, gap-toothed and grinning. At 10, proud in his Little League uniform. At 18, graduating valedictorian. These weren't pictures of a future murderer, they were snapshots of a boy who'd somehow lost his way completely. The phone rang. My neighbor Margaret invited me for dinner. She'd been checking on me regularly since the trial, part of a small circle of friends who'd rallied around me. "Frank," she said gently when I arrived, "you know this wasn't your fault, right? You were a good father. Sometimes people just choose darkness despite every light you try to shine for them." Her husband Tom nodded in agreement. "I've seen thousands of kids over the years, Frank. Some from terrible homes who become wonderful adults, others from loving families who choose destructive paths. In the end, we all make our own choices." Their teenage grandson Michael looked at me with youthful curiosity. "Mr. Thompson, weren't you scared when you found out your son was trying to kill you?" "Yes, Michael, I was terrified. But I was more angry than scared. Angry that someone I'd loved and trusted had betrayed me so completely." "What made you decide to fight back?" Another excellent question. Because accepting it would have meant letting him win. It would have meant that all the sacrifices, all the love, all the years of trying to raise him right had been for nothing. Fighting back was the only way to honor the man I'd tried to be as his father. That night, for the first time since Rick's warning at Murphy's Tavern, I slept peacefully in my own bed. The man who'd tried to kill me was locked away, the poison was out of my system, and tomorrow was just another day instead of a deadline for murder. But more than that, I'd learned something crucial about myself, that even at 68, even after decades of putting others first, I still had fight left in me when it truly mattered. The weeks that followed my testimony were a strange mixture of healing and discovery. I found myself reconnecting with old friends from the factory, men I'd worked alongside for decades but had lost touch with after retirement. When the story of Derek's crimes hit the local newspapers, many of them reached out to offer support, and I was surprised by how much their friendship meant to me. "Frank, I always thought there was something off about that boy," said Tom Kowalski, a former co-worker who invited me to join his weekly poker game. "Too smooth, too polished, like he was always performing instead of just being himself. My kids might not be doctors, but at least they still call their old man to check up on him." These conversations helped me realize something important. I hadn't failed as a father just because Derek had turned into a monster. The values I'd tried to instill, the love I'd given freely, the sacrifices I'd made willingly, none of that had been wasted, even if Derek had rejected all of it. The fault lay not in my parenting, but in choices Derek had made as an adult, choices that had nothing to do with how he'd been raised. I started volunteering at the local senior center, helping other elderly people navigate the complex world of insurance claims and medical paperwork. My experience with Derek's deception had given me insights into how easily older adults could be manipulated by people they trusted, and I found purpose in using that knowledge to protect others. "Mr. Thompson," said Eleanor Martinez, an 80-year-old widow whose nephew had been pressuring her to sign over power of attorney, "I don't know what I would have done without your help. He seemed so sincere, so concerned about my welfare, but you helped me see the warning signs." These conversations reminded me that Derek's crimes weren't unique. Elder abuse was unfortunately common, with family members often being the perpetrators. But unlike many victims, I'd been able to fight back, to expose the truth, to seek justice. That gave me a sense of responsibility to help others who might not be as fortunate or as stubborn as I'd been. I'd learned something important during these past months. Loving someone doesn't mean enabling their worst impulses or covering for their crimes. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold them accountable for the choices they make, even when those choices break your heart completely. Derek might hate me for the rest of his life for putting him in prison, but at least he'd have a life to live, which is more than he'd planned to give me. 6 months after the trial, I received my first letter from Derek in prison. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was 3 pages of self-pity and blame, with Derek alternately claiming he'd been framed and insisting that I'd never understood the pressures he'd been under as a successful professional. "You destroyed my life because you couldn't accept that I'd outgrown our family's limitations," he wrote in his familiar handwriting. "I was trying to build something meaningful, and you tore it all down out of spite and jealousy." I read the letter twice, then filed it away in a drawer. Derek still didn't understand what he'd done wrong, still saw himself as the victim in this situation. Perhaps prison would eventually teach him accountability, or perhaps he'd spend the next 25 years blaming everyone but himself for his choices. Either way, it was no longer my responsibility to fix him or save him from the consequences of his actions. Derek would be eligible for parole in 25 years when he was 60 and I was 93. Part of me hoped he'd use that time to remember the boy he'd once been. But mostly, I tried not to think about Derek Thompson at all. The son I'd loved was dead. The man who'd tried to kill me was paying for his crimes. And Frank Thompson was still here, still standing, still grateful for every breath. The boy in those old photographs was gone, lost somewhere in the pursuit of money and status. But the father who'd raised him was still here, still breathing, still capable of finding meaning in whatever years remained. And maybe that was enough. If you found something meaningful in my story, I hope it reminds you to cherish the people who truly love you and to be wary of those who see your love as something to be exploited. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is refusing to be a victim, fighting back against those who would harm us, and holding people accountable, regardless of our relationship to them. Please share your thoughts about family, love, and justice in the comments below, and if this story moved you, consider sharing it with others who might benefit from hearing it. Thank you for listening to one man's journey from victim to survivor, and remember, it's never too late to fight for your life, your dignity, and your right to be treated with respect.